All right. So thank you for having me. My name is Naftali Balanson. I'm calling in from Israel. I work at NGO Monitor, which is a Jerusalem-based research institute, and I'll give you a little bit more about us in a minute. Just a short intro about what NGO Monitor does, and then after that, we'll delve into some of the NGOs behind anti-Semitism in Canada, and what we know and what we don't know about their funding. Um, so NGO Monitor, our primary research focus is on the political war against Israel's existence. In parallel to the very real and thankfully so far failed physical threats and attempts to eliminate Israel, there is a soft power war that seeks to deny Israel's legitimacy throughout the world, to quote unquote, to peacefully eliminate, so to speak, the Jewish state. Whereas you have the physical war, which is conducted by Palestinian terror groups and other states and terrorists that are within the Iranian axis, there is simultaneously and trying to accomplish very similar things, but using different methods, a soft power war, a political war that is being fought against Israel. And this part of the war is conducted by non-governmental organizations or NGOs. These are unelected and non-democratic groups. And often they claim to promote things like human rights and humanitarian values and international law. But as we see, they very often are involved in anti-Israel activity and in anti-Semitism. And to achieve their goals, which is isolating Israel and preventing Israel from exercising self-defense, they accuse Israel of worst things a country or people can do. We've all seen and heard the accusations, especially since October 7th, whether it's genocide, apartheid, extermination, starvation, crimes against humanity. We've seen some NGOs that will accuse Israel of committing rape in a very stark form of atrocity inversion, where they sort of take the crimes that were perpetrated against Jewish people and sort of accuse Israel of doing those same things, accuse Israel and Jews of doing the same things. And that's often why you'll see NGOs using Holocaust rhetoric to speak of Israel and Israelis as being the new Nazis. Now, even though since October 7th, these are things that are quite prominent and visible, including in the media, we at NGO Monitor have seen for decades that these organizations have been voicing these types of allegations and using this type of very dangerous and violent rhetoric against Israel and against Jews. Unfortunately, though, NGOs can be very effective when they use this type of rhetoric. This is because of what we at NGO Monitor call the halo effect. And that is to say that NGOs present themselves as embracing good things like human rights and peace and justice. And when they do that, everyone believes them to be benevolent and neutral actors and not political activists. And this halo effect grants them legitimacy, it grants them access to the media and to governments and to policymakers and decision makers. And also, as we'll explain in a minute, it also grants them access to money. But just if we want to just speak for a second in the Canadian context, there was, the canceling of weapons export licenses that happened in Canada, also happened in the UK and in other countries. Canceling of export licenses to Israel since October 7th, a lot of that is a result of campaigning by NGOs. And of course, we need to mention that there is one human rights issue that NGOs consistently ignore and fail to address, and that would be anti-Jewish hatred and violence against Jews and anti-Semitism, which of course, those of you in Canada have experienced firsthand in a way that I did not think I would see in my lifetime. Now, getting towards funding in a very general sense, our research shows that NGOs are able to access a significant amount of money from governments to pursue their agendas. Globally, we estimate that approximately $275 million goes every year to groups from governments to groups that are actively politically in the Arab-Israeli conflict. Much of this funding is non-transparent. The governments refuse to divulge details about the projects, about the local partners. Our research has shown that when we do know who the local partners are, some of them are Palestinian NGOs linked to terror groups, but they are somehow able to access this funding. In some cases, the governments themselves do not know where their money is going. NGOs, and those agencies and NGOs don't bother to properly vet the downstream partners. We had an exchange a number of years ago with the Canadian government about a project that was happening in the West Bank and Gaza, involving a UN funding that was going to a Palestinian NGO that is linked to a terror group, linked to the PFLP. When we brought this to the attention of the Canadian government, they said it's just not true. And when we showed them the documentation proving it was true, then they gave us all sorts of explanations to explain how it was possible, how the money was being routed through the UN, and it wasn't really Canadian money, things of that nature. But in general, the governments, as I said, are non-transparent about what's happening, and they also oftentimes don't really know. Excuse me. So NGO Monitor was founded in 2002 with the express purpose of researching and exposing those NGOs behind the political war against Israel. We primarily work vis-a-vis governments and diplomats and UN bodies, and we call for cuts in funding to anti-Israel and pro-terror NGOs, as well as for sensible policies that will prevent such funding in the future. So after that introduction and just sort of general overlook about what about what NGO Monitor is all about and what our research shows, I want to turn to Canada. About 6 months ago, we conducted a mapping of the network of NGOs and funders most responsible for anti-Israel advocacy and anti-Semitism, such as the intimidation and violence that we saw on university campuses since October 7th. At the time, we had identified 111 groups with high levels of interconnectivity. And this showed a really well-coordinated and diverse effort to push out that narrative, especially on university campuses, but not also, and as I'm sure many of you, if not all of you, have experienced on the streets of Canadian cities. I want to draw your attention to 3 specific NGOs within this context. The first is Samidoun. This is a Vancouver-based NGO that actually has branches across the Western world and in Iran, actually. It's closely linked to the PFLP, and it's probably the most vocal supporter of pro-violence rhetoric across Canada and the United States. And actually in Belgium, just earlier this week, they organized a rally where there was a celebratory reenactment of the October 7th massacres. So that's the type of organization we're dealing with. And I just want to read to you a quote from one of the leading officials of Samidoun. This was in response to the tragic and horrific murders that happened in Washington, D.C., where 2 Israeli diplomats were killed last month. And her name is Charlotte Cates, if you've heard of her. And she wrote, "Genocide has to have consequences. And if there are no consequences imposed, it's only logical that people will find alternative means of imposing consequences." So this is the type of rhetoric that comes out of this organization. As I mentioned, it is based in Vancouver. And although Samidoun's PFLP links and pro-terror rhetoric were well known for years, it was only banned by Canada and the United States in October 2024. And even the banning of these organizations, certainly in Canada, it's been a very limited ban. There have been no teeth to the ban. As I mentioned, I just referred to a statement, a tweet from one of the leaders from just a couple weeks ago. They are still active, even if technically the organization is not supposed to be operating. So that's number one, Samidun. Another organization, which is called Palestinian Youth Movement. And this is also a PFLP-linked organization. It's much murkier, though, than Samidun. As far as we can tell, it's not actually officially registered anywhere. But groups that, they're groups operating under that name throughout North America and Europe. And most notably, it was one of the leaders in the campus encampments and other anti-Semitic disruptions that we've seen since October 7th. The third one I want to mention is Independent Jewish Voices. Much like Jewish Voice for Peace, which is an American group, it serves as a fig leaf, a Jewish fig leaf, for anti-Israel activists, allowing them to claim that they aren't anti-Semitic. Because look, they're Jews who support what we're saying. Our research indicates that there are not so many people involved with Independent Jewish Voices, but it still is a central player in the network. It has 9 university and 18 regional chapters in Canada. And our research, when we did the mapping, we saw that it was connected, it had partnered in various degrees with 76 of the 111 groups. So those are 3 NGOs, and they sort of represent, I would say, some of the more important NGOs in the Canadian network, in the anti-Israel Canadian NGO network. But these NGOs, they tend to have been, that we were discussing, they're involved with what I'd call street level activities, protests, demonstrations, maybe webinars, encampments, the RCMP investigation, and how they had put out a statement saying that they weren't actually conducting criminal investigations, that it was a quote, a structural investigation, whatever that means. But most importantly, from our perspective, that they were opening and preparing to open an online portal in a number of different languages to allow people from around the world to submit evidence, and for potential witnesses to submit their statements. And I think that's something that needs to be considered in the context of what NGO Monitor calls lawfare, or legal warfare. In particular, efforts by NGOs around the world to have Israeli leaders and IDF officers and soldiers arrested. I mentioned Hind Rajab Foundation, which is based in Europe. I think it's based in Belgium. It's led by some quote unquote former Hezbollah activists, and they're very pro-violence, and they've been chasing Israeli soldiers around and trying to have them arrested and investigated in all sorts of jurisdictions. And now it doesn't require much imagination or sophistication to understand how NGOs like Hind Rajab and others, I'll mention some Canadian ones, could exploit that type of RCMP online portal. They could bombard it with all sorts of supposed evidence of war crimes that have some sort of like the UN Commission with names and incidents. They've done the same thing at the International Criminal Court. And I mentioned other countries, as I mentioned before, they're doing this in other countries. And unless the RCMP understands this concept, this context, and that this is a distinct possibility, they will not be prepared to prevent their framework from being exploited. Now, locally in Canada, there is a deeply disturbing project called IDF, a publication called The Mabel. It contains over 160 names of Canadian citizens who served in the IDF. Now, on one hand, it's very easy to ridicule this project. Some of the people listed are no longer living. Some fought as far back as 1948. At the same time, there are, I guess, creepy is the word to use, elements that deserve to be taken seriously, especially in light of the violence we saw in DC and in Boulder, Colorado very recently. There's personal information about the soldiers or the former soldiers, like the synagogues they attended or where their parents work. And I want to just read to you a tweet from the journalist who is behind this this project called Find IDF Soldiers. His name is David Mastracci, and he wrote, this is back in 2022. If the Canadian government really cared about fighting the illegal occupation and annexation of land abroad, it would send weapons to Hamas. Now, that was in 2022. He got in trouble online and claimed he was being rhetorical. But that is the type of people who are putting out detailed information about Canadian citizens who volunteered, or maybe they're dual citizens and they had to serve in the Israeli armed forces. Another form of lawfare is lawsuits against federal governments, trying to force them to impose sanctions against Israel. So usually it's in the form of arms embargoes. Since October 7th, we've seen this in the UK, the Netherlands, and even in the United States. One such lawsuit was brought in Canada by a group calling itself the Coalition for Canadian Accountability in Gaza. And that is made up of the Legal Center for Palestine, the International Center of Justice for Palestinians Canada, Hamid Law, and A. Dimitri Lascaris Law Professional Corporation. They filed a lawsuit in November 2024, accusing the federal government of Canada of complicity in genocide and demanding that they stop sending weapons to Israel and that they stop supporting Israel. Their language actually was one of the ways that they were complicit is because they refused to exercise influence over Israel. And there, a hearing, the Canadian government submitted a motion to dismiss, and that hearing is only scheduled for November of this year, and a ruling probably won't be till 2026. But as with many of these types of lawfare cases, what the activists are more interested in is the PR and generating bad publicity for Israel and associating Israel with ideas such as genocide, and really in causing difficulty for the government of Canada to make any support they would have for Israel more costly. Another NGO coalition is called Canadian Lawyers for International Human Rights. And this group has been working with a Palestinian NGO called Al-Haq. Al-Haq is linked to the PFLP terror declared in October 2022, I believe. And in March of 2024, they demanded a judicial review to enforce an arms embargo, a total arms embargo against Israel. And I would just note in this context that in September of 2024, Canada announced the suspension of 30 arms export licenses for Israel. And the other thing this group tried to do was try to prevent the clearing of the encampment at U of T, at University of Toronto, when the authorities were trying to do so. Now let's step back. And I just want to say a few words about the funding for these organizations. We at NGO Monitor have spent considerable resources to try to trace the funding for the NGOs involved with anti-Israel activity in Canada. Overall, there is very little transparency, especially when compared to what we learned in the United States. One of the differences is that in Canada, like the UK, has two different categories for registration, charities versus nonprofit corporations with different reporting requirements. In any case, we found and identified small amounts from progressive social justice foundations, but nothing extraordinary that is so special. The NGOs that I mentioned that are involved in the lawfare cases, they are not transparent about their donors. The Maple, which runs the Find IDF Soldiers campaign, it says that it's entirely reader funded. And it reported approximately $65,000 Canadian in income in 2020. But not 2025. Good information in that direction. Some of the NGOs that we look at, though, and that we mentioned, they use what's called fiscal sponsorship, which means that a registered charity raises funds on their behalf. Now, fiscal sponsorship can be convenient and efficient for groups because it avoids administrative costs and time, but it also allows the NGOs to hide a lot, such as the identity of donors and the employees and expenses. So, for instance, Samidu's funding, there's very little known about it. But we do know it raises funds through a US-based charity called Alliance for Global Justice that's based in Arizona. And a number of online donation platforms, upon learning about Samidu's connections to terror groups, took down their, withdrew their services from the Alliance for Global Justice. But once again, because there's this pass-through, it's difficult to really see what's going on. Likewise, Palestinian Youth Movement, they use something called Honor the Earth, which is also based in the United States, and it is, quote, an indigenous-led organization fighting to dismantle settler colonialism, racial capitalism, white supremacy, and imperialism. And actually, Palestinian Youth Movement is an interesting example and situation because they used to use a different organization called Westpac, which is it's based in Westchester, New York. It was a foundation, but in the past year, Westpac and Palestinian Youth Movements have been named in a number of lawsuits because of the latter's activism. Westpac itself is under legal and financial siege. Its insurers refusing to cover its legal costs. And Palestinian Youth Movement and other NGOs that were fiscally sponsored by it have jumped ship to other sponsors. There's also a lot of misinformation about funding for these types of NGOs, which I think can be instructive. I want to read to you from an article from May 2024 in the Canadian CBC outlets, trying to debunk the claim that the campus instability post-October 7th was being caused by outsiders. That really everything was student run, and it was all from the organizations on the campus. And what was the proof? And they said the encampments appear to be organized and led by students or university-age people. And they bring the example of McGill, where the first Canadian campus encampment was formed. And they write, the CBC writes, the official student group Solidarity for Palestinian Human Rights McGill youth movement. So this is the proof. Except this really doesn't tell us anything, because who is the Palestinian Youth Movement? Who gives them money? I would just say that there have been reports of foreign funding from countries hostile to Israel to Palestinian Youth Movement, but this is not confirmed. But more importantly, how many of the people actually involved in the Palestinian Youth Movement are actually youths? Nobody knows. It seems in this case that the media wasn't willing to dig beyond the name of the NGO and ended up obscuring matters even more. So what can we do about it? What can we do? We mentioned that there is no transparency. So the first and really the most important thing is transparency. There should be transparency about funding, especially while the encampments were going on and while they were disturbing activities. And I mean, that's really an understatement, but while they were disruptive on campuses, we felt that the campuses should be demanding information from the activists to say, who's giving you the money? How is these things happening? And the authorities should have also taken that opportunity to investigate more clearly. I mentioned the problems that Westpac was having, and I think there is opportunity to take steps against fiscal sponsors when they can be identified. There, as I mentioned, there are a number of lawsuits being that have made a very interesting approach and might be fruitful for accountability for those that are enabling anti-Semitism. The other thing, I think the other conclusion I would draw is that, unfortunately, authorities don't always take it seriously enough. They simply assume everything's okay until it's not okay. And Samidu is unfortunately a great example of that, where they banned them, but they haven't really done anything about it. Here, we think that one way to go is to operationalize the IRA working definition of anti-Semitism. That is a working definition that over 30 governments in the world, including Canada, have adopted as a good model for identifying what is anti-Semitism, and using that in the context of examining NGO activity can be very fruitful in terms of really being able to put a finger on what is anti-Semitism and how some of the rhetoric being used does cross that line. The other thing we would say, the other recommendations and solutions we have is of the problem. It needs to be taken seriously. The violence against Jews around the world, especially in Canada, is unacceptable. And there really shouldn't be double standards. There shouldn't be double standards when Jewish groups are might be scrutinized very intensely. And we see that some of the groups that are perpetuating anti-Semitism and anti-Israel activity sort of skate. So I don't know if we're doing questions now or later, but I'm happy to stick around until the end of the session and hear what the other panelists have to say, and if anyone has any questions.
Are there any questions?
Yeah.
We do have a few questions.
I have a simple question. What's your file on CJPME? What are they up to?
Oh, on CJPME. Oh, that's another good example where a handful of people can cause a lot of trouble. What is it? 1 or 3 people? Last I checked, it's a very small group of people. Very vocal, very active, and it's problematic. I recall correctly, I checked, I think they actually were registered both as a charity and then they also had a nonprofit corporation. I'm not sure. So yeah, they're a problem. It's a private individual, right? It's one guy, right? If I'm not mistaken.
It's about 3 or 4 of them.
Yeah,
okay, 3 or 4.
And they mount character assassination campaigns against various professionals, professionals, and teachers.
We've been caught up in some of those in previous years with some of our employees and organizations. Yeah. That's another good one yet to add to the list.
So I have a question about the RCMP investigation. This is something that apparently started at some point in 2024, and as a member of the Canadian public, I only became aware of it very recently, and I think most of us became aware of it very recently. And when I contacted my MP, I happened to, not just for my son, who's a dual citizen and served in the IDF, but for so many reasons and on so many levels, this is so wrong. And even I came to my attention that some MPs weren't aware of it, like my MP. And I found that pretty shocking, although they were starting to get letters. And I guess when you say, is the RCMP even aware of how this can be abused? How do you suggest we make it our business to make sure the RCMP is aware of how this can be abused? Because I would like to make it my business to do that.
Sure. Well, I think the first thing is to, document both within Canada, but also internationally, the phenomenon of NGOs exploiting these NGOs with nefarious purposes, exploiting these types of frameworks, and to contact them. I don't know the specific direction, although it could be that through the MPs, if they're willing to do so. Although I'm sure there are people within the RCMP who also can be contacted in the department that does it. If we can assist with that, with some of the research, we're available. You can ask the organizers here how to contact me, and happy to do so. But yeah, some of this is just education, and some of it ultimately, and this is unfortunate with these types of things, it almost becomes inevitable that that's what's going to happen. That even if they have the greatest intentions, or their intentions are completely neutral, not anti-Israel, and very broad swath of NGOs out there that know how to exploit these frameworks. It will happen. Like, if they open that portal, it will happen. Undoubtedly, to the extent that that translates into criminal investigations, where it goes, I can't answer that. I don't know enough about both the politics and as well as the how those investigations work in Canada. But
I will weigh in on that one when I start my comments.
Okay. Yeah, I'm sure that I'm sure that there are people in Canada who have a lot more expertise than me sitting here in Israel on how these procedures and mechanisms actually work.
I'd like to ask about Samadun. If an organization is banned, and we can see Charlotte Cates is on the street still screaming her garbage, can she be sued? Is there some strategy in place or some action that can be taken against the Samadun folks?
Yeah, I don't, from my discussions, anti-terror law on these matters is limited, but for my discussions with people who have more expertise than I, it seems like, and it's a bizarre situation, but that the organization is officially banned, which I guess, or has certain restrictions on whether it can own a bank account and property and things like that, or operate a bank account. But all the people involved with it are still allowed to keep on doing what they are doing, and they can continue to work under the Samadun name. It seems very bizarre. You would think that the authorities would take more action. It's strange to us that they haven't.
Again, Naftali, I can weigh in on that. I'm very familiar with listed entities in Canada.
Yeah, so excellent. So I'll leave it to Phil and to others to give you, and hopefully to give you better answers to those questions. I will just say, I wholeheartly support your question and think it's a really, really good question. We ask ourselves that all the time, and anytime we have a conversation with a Canadian, government officials, we ask that very, very exact question. Like, how is that even possible? It doesn't make sense.
Happy to hear from you, Phil.
Well, I don't know. Can I, while you're still live, you talk about transparency and using the American model. What do you think you could sort of, I don't know how much you've looked at the Canadian situation, but what would you recommend that we, as an action item and a policy development, where would we focus, do you think, to increase transparency in what's obviously a big problem?
Right. So look, in terms of the American model, I don't want to go down that road, just because I think there are probably a lot of other factors that go into why Canada has a dual, why you can register in different ways and why there are different rules for charities. Even if it's a historical thing, I can't even imagine what it would take to change that policy. That being said, I think there are opportunities that emerged from the antisemitism, 20 months, maybe, whatever it is, the past 20 months, that really give an opportunity where officials and leaders in Canada can demand, for instance, I guess if I'm going to refer to an American model, it wouldn't be from the IRS side, but from the perspective, which was the equivalent of Canadian revenue, but from the perspective of Congress, where there were congressional hearings about what was happening on campuses. And there is an organization known as American Muslims for Palestine. They are being investigated by the Virginia State general, who how there's this lengthy, drawn-out legal process. The point being that even asking those questions, so if Canadian leaders and government officials, even from the opposition, are asking questions about where is your funding, how are you able to cause such disruptions on campus? Where did that money come from? Who are the people backing this? When, fine, so it's Palestinian youth movement is providing the backing for everything that was happening in Montreal. What does that even mean? Where does Palestinian youth movement in Montreal get their money? Where does this all come from? What are the interests? Even asking those questions already, putting the NGOs on the defensive and making them be uncomfortable. And instead of what had been happening, where they were on the offensive in a very direct and sometimes violent way. And so I think that's really that I think would be a more feasible direction. Changing Canadian charity registration, that's probably I don't know. You need to speak to some Canadian lawyers.
Well, the charities
and lobbyists, I don't know.
Yeah, the charities report, but the NGOs that are not registered charities don't have the same reporting requirement. And
right. So
universities don't report either. So their foreign funding going to universities is completely hidden.
Oh, that's interesting. Because in the United States, as maybe you're aware, there's a lot of movement on that issue. But even there's still some questions about how much is actually being revealed versus not revealed. It's not so clear.
Mark Sandler has a question for you. Mark, are you there?
I asked him in the chat. I was waiting for I sent him a message about that. If you had a question, to go free. I don't know if he just has his hand up high, but let's yeah. Can we have a?
I have one more question. Has NGO Monitor been doing any work in the space of GoFundMe and similar online fundraising platforms?
Yeah.
Because I've seen that some of the smaller NGOs make liberal use of GoFundMe. There's one fellow I noted that had committed a hate crime and was charged with it in Nova Scotia, who raised over $1.5 million in anonymous donations through a GoFundMe platform.
Oh. First of all, if you can send me those details, if you can give out my Hadassah, you can give out my email address. Please send us the details about that. Number one, we usually work with partners in the United States. When they get a lawyer letter from a lawyer in the country where the financial platform is based, that's usually more effective than some random yahoos sitting in an office building in Jerusalem. We do work with partners there. We also have some partners here in Israel that have international reach. For that, I had mentioned before, SAMI doing fiscal sponsor in Arizona, the Alliance for Global Justice. So they're working with partners in the United States. That's how we were able to, to convince a variety of online platforms to take away their services. I mentioned the Al Haq, which is a Palestinian NGO, and a number of other Palestinian NGOs. They lost their bank accounts with various financial service providers, in part based on our research and our research being by various lawyers. And so if you send me the details about that, we'll look into it. It's definitely something we know people who I can't make any promises, but hopefully could be successful, because if there was a hate crime involved, I would imagine there is room for them to intervene.